Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today, pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark shares the last message in his powerful series of the life of Abraham and joins Arnie Cole and Kara Whitney in studio for a discussion that will help you discover the abundant life God promises to his followers. It's time now for our study. Here's Bryan Clark.
In a sense, Genesis chapter 25 is the funeral message for Abraham. In that funeral message, the writer of Genesis says something very interesting that will help us think about how we want to live our lives. Genesis 25, 1 through 4. Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore to him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. And Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim, and Letushim, and Lemim, and the sons of Midian were Ephah, and Epher, and Hanok, and Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the sons of Keturah. There's a lot of discussion about Keturah in terms of who was she? The bottom line is we don't know. Her name means covered with incense, which doesn't give us a lot of clarity. There's a lot of argument about whether or not Abraham should have married her and should he have had these sons. But there's a couple things I think we need to think about. One is God had promised Abraham earlier that he would be the father of many nations. And this is very consistent with that this would be part of God's blessing and fulfillment of that promise. The other thing that's worth thinking about is when Abraham was 100 years old, according to Paul in Romans chapter 4, his body was as good as dead in terms of its ability to have a child. And so we understand that the birth of Isaac was a miraculous thing, could not be accomplished in the flesh, had to be a miraculous work of the Spirit of God. That was the whole point of it. That was at age 100. When Abraham started having these sons, he would have been about 140. Now, if you're going to make your argument that Abraham was able to do that on his own in the flesh, I think that's a big stretch. I think it could only reflect the blessing of God, and I think that's very consistent with where Abraham was at in his journey. And this was part of God's blessing in the last chapter of his life, a fulfillment of a promise to be the father of many nations. So that's how I see that section there. Verse 5, now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines. Now you're saying, who were his concubines? Well, it was Hagar and it was Keturah. In a sense, they would distinguish between what would have been called the primary wife, which would have been Sarah, through whom the child of promise came, and what would be referred to as the secondary wife, which would have been also termed as concubines, Hagar and Keturah. So that's very typical language, and I think that's who he's referring to here. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. And these are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life. And he was gathered to his people. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. And it came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived by Beer Lahai Roi. That is the closure to the story of Abraham. It tells about the years of his life, 175. He breathed his last, died at a ripe old age, an old man satisfied with life. Isn't that a great statement? The word satisfied, the Hebrew word, means to be content. We live in a culture of dissatisfaction. So wouldn't it be a great thing to get to the end of our lives and have it said of us, he or she died satisfied with life? As a matter of fact, I'd like that on my headstone, just that one word, satisfied, because that's what we're all after. The question is, how do we get there? Well, how did Abraham get there? If we were to pick one word that characterizes the life of Abraham, it would probably be the word faith. Abraham was a hero of faith. As a matter of fact, he may very well have been the greatest person of faith in the Old Testament. It is by faith that Abraham was satisfied. So I'd like to spend the rest of our time going back and just reviewing what have been the lessons of faith that we've learned from Abraham. It started all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham was called by God to leave Ur of the Chaldeans for a better place. Ur of the Chaldeans, which was Abraham's homeland, represents this world. It represents this world's pleasures. It represents this world's material goods. It represents this world's relationships. But God came to Abraham and said to Abraham, Abraham, there's something more than that. There's something that will ultimately satisfy, and I'm asking you by faith to trust me and to go with me to this land of promise, to a better place. And Abraham believed by faith that there is something better. There's something more, so he left. That's where some of you are. You've tried the stuff of this world and you've concluded this just doesn't satisfy. There's got to be something more to life than just this. There's got to be something more than what this world offers that will ultimately satisfy. And you've taken your first step in this journey of faith. But it's also possible to begin this journey of faith, but to get lost somewhere along the way and to go back to the old habits and patterns and really go back to believing this world can satisfy. I think in the story of Abraham, that's represented by Lot. When Lot had a chance to take a piece of property that looked just like Egypt, is what the text says, he took it. He moved down outside of Sodom, and pretty soon he was living in the city of Sodom, which represented what this world offers to try to make us happy. As far as we know, Lot died very disappointed, very despairing, very dissatisfied. What he believed would ultimately make him happy just led to misery.
We're so glad you've tuned in today. Here at Back to the Bible, our heart is to share God's Word to help you experience a closer walk with Christ and move forward in faith. So to support you along the way, we've designed a wide variety of resources, and they're available at backtothebible.org. From devotions to in-depth Bible studies, Bible reading plans, even research and stories, you'll discover what you need to strengthen you along your spiritual journey. And of course, our Back to the Bible messages with Bryan Clark are also there to listen to anytime you want. Just visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now here's Bryan Clark with more from his message in Genesis chapter 24.
God made the promise to Abraham that I'm going to enter into a covenant relationship with you, and these are my promises. But Abraham struggled with, how do I know that God's going to keep these promises? In other words, what is the basis upon which God's going to keep these promises to him? And so God demonstrated that to Abraham when he cut a covenant with him. But in this particular case, it was a unilateral covenant. It was made by one person. God alone walked through the blood, which was God's way of saying, Abraham, I want you to know, if either I or you fail to keep the covenant, I will shed my blood in order to make it right. And Abraham believed that, and he was declared by God to be righteous. What does it take to stand before God right? Every religion of the world teaches that you have to do something to earn God's favor, except Christianity. Christianity teaches you must only believe that God will deal with our failure to keep his covenant by shedding his own blood on our behalf. All we do is believe by faith, and we are declared righteous. The Hebrew people believed that. And for 2,000 years, every day at 3 o'clock in the temple, they would take the lamb and they would slit the throat of the lamb, and the blood would flow down over the rocks of the altar, and they would look at that blood and they would remember God promised to shed his blood for our failure to keep the covenant so that he could keep his promise to us. And they were reminded every time they saw the blood. And they did that for 2,000 years until that point when God became flesh. And God allowed himself to be nailed to a cross. And exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the priest took the knife to the throat of the lamb, God in the flesh shed his blood and died on that cross. God had indeed kept his promise to Abraham, that he himself would shed his blood because of our inability to keep the covenant. And on the basis of his shed blood, those who believe are reckoned as righteous. That is a critical step of faith. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say, if you do not enter into that covenant relationship with God by faith, you cannot be satisfied. You cannot. That is absolutely a necessary step of faith. Abraham believed, and he was declared righteous. Abraham taught us that there are times when faith means that we courageously step out in order to rescue the perishing. His nephew Lot was captured in the city of Sodom and hauled off by the kings of the north. And Abraham believed by faith, even though his army was much smaller and no real power to take on the kings of the north, that God would give him the victory by faith. So he took off by faith and he won an incredible victory. But in the process of that, he learned both the risk and the reward of faith. The reward of faith is when we step out by faith and we trust God to do what only God can do. God loves it when his people step out courageously by faith, because then he can show that he's God. Then he can do his thing and people will be amazed at the hand of God and they'll worship. But he also learned the risk of faith, and the risk of faith is when God does something impressive, it can go to our heads. And we start to think it's about us. And pretty soon it's more about me than it is about God. Abraham had that risk. He was offered the world's possessions in response for what he did, but he said, I don't want it. This isn't about me. This is about God. But Abraham also taught us that sometimes we don't step out by faith. Sometimes faith means we just wait. And I have to say, I don't think there's anything harder than waiting by faith. Abraham and Sarah were promised in their old age that they would have a son. And they believed God. And I can't even imagine the excitement in their home as they celebrated this coming event of a son. And probably the first month, second month, they were just so excited. But after the first and second month and 6 months and a year, still no son. And after 2 years and 3 years and 5 years and 8 years and 10 years, still no son. What had started as this wondrous experience was now sliding into this deep, deep despair. They were starting to wonder if God does tell the truth. And so they came up with their own plan. That Abraham would have relations with Sarah's maid, and they would have a son through her. So that's what they did. And when that son was born, God said, I want you to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. Because the problem was that they had come to a point where they believed God wasn't hearing their prayers anymore. And they had to take matters into their own hands. And they made a terrible mistake. A mistake which the results are seen every night on the nightly news as the Palestinians and the Jews continue to have it out. Abraham and Sarah would have to learn that faith sometimes means we just wait. They would wait well over another decade before the promised seed would come. And when they began to doubt whether or not God hears, they just had to call Ishmael for supper. They had to remember in the name, God hears. God hears. We made that mistake once. Let's not make it again. And they did. They waited patiently until God sent the promised seed. Sometimes faith means we step out, and sometimes faith means we just wait. Abraham also taught us that in the journey of faith, failure is not final. Abraham was a giant of the faith, but he had some miserable failures. Sometimes we fail, and it's in those failures that we often learn the most about who we are and who God is and where we're at on our journey. Sometimes we learn the most significant lessons in our times of failure. But that's when we have to get up, brush ourselves off, confess our sin, and get back on the journey. Failure is not final. Ultimately, then, we learned this great lesson of faith in Genesis 22, which was the final exam, when Abraham took that which he loved the most, his son Isaac, and was willing to sacrifice him back to God in an act of faith. And we learned that the ultimate act of faith is to take that which we love the most and lay it on the altar and say, God, you can have it. You can have my money, you can have my house, you can have my health, you can have anything you want. At that point, we are truly free. But we don't arrive there overnight. It's a part of a journey of faith. It was Abraham's journey of faith that led him to the point where, at his funeral, the writer would say he was satisfied with life. If we're going to experience this abundant life that goes beyond the ordinary, goes beyond the explainable, goes beyond the predictable, this life of faith, then we have to be willing to believe that God tells the truth. I opened this series talking about a song sung by Leanne Womack called I Hope You Dance. She uses dance as kind of a metaphor for being willing to step out beyond the ordinary and take in what life has to offer. And the key line in the song is, when you have a choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. That's what we've been talking about. My prayer for you would be, when you have a choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. You dance this dance of faith with the God for whom nothing is too wondrous. That you live, that you experience the abundant life that goes beyond the stuff of this world. To experience what it means to be satisfied by faith.
Now let's go to Bryan Clark in the studio for some encouraging insights from today's study with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
Bryan, you mentioned having pivotal points in life that really confirm what you believe. So can you give us one of yours?
Yeah, so before I've mentioned my dad's story and how formative that was in my life, but also for me personally, I was always involved in sports and really active. When I was 39 years old, found out I had heart problems and was going to have heart surgery. And I think a pivotal moment in that was, there were a couple. One, I had a heart cath. I was already scheduled for surgery the next day, but the cath was to see if I had blockage. My issues were birth defects in my valves. And so the cardiologist came back and I said something that I thought was kind of funny. And it was immediately evident he was not in a laughing mood. He was very serious. And he said, Bryan, there is no human explanation for why you're alive. He said, none of us in the cath lab can figure it out. So if you have a pinhole where your aortic valve is supposed to be, there's no way you should be alive. And immediately they hooked me up to machines. I stayed the night and they did the surgery the next day. So from that moment on, I've had a clear sense that I'm on borrowed time,
right,
and I shouldn't be alive, and there must be some reason. So I think we all know we're mortal, but we don't know we're mortal. There's moments in life that change that. It's a pretty defining moment in my life, yeah.
As an entrepreneur for most of my life, I always believed that no risk, no reward, no gain without pain, And after studying Abraham's life, would you say that the same holds true for faith?
Yeah, I heard someone once say, where there is no risk, there is no faith. And I think that's true. If there's no risk, then what are you trusting God for? So it's not easy. It isn't supposed to be. It's the kind of at the core of Hebrews 11. This is really hard. And you're living your whole life for a city whose builder and architect is God, and you won't see it till after you die. So the faith walk isn't easy. And I think there's times in life where you reach a point where all you can do with all of your strength is just hold on and believe. It just feels like everything's falling apart, everything's confused, and you hang on, you believe. So think about with Abraham and Sarah. What if it isn't true? I mean, what if they misunderstood, or what if God didn't tell the truth? They put everything on the line. They gave up everything for the sake of the promise. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. We're just pitiful if it isn't true. So that is the risk of faith, and we believe.
Bryan, this series on Abraham has really been outstanding.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I love Genesis, and I love this story. And we'll get back to it and continue on in Genesis. But next week, we're starting a new study in 1 Peter. 1 Peter is all about suffering and pain and struggles. Nero was starting to persecute Christians.
Oh, right.
The first readers were suffering, but their lives were about to get way more difficult. And Peter tells them in the midst of all of that, they can still find hope. You think about people in our culture today, everybody's waiting for something to change. We can feel it, it's unraveling. So who's going to change it? The politicians? The media? Is it the economy? And in the middle of all that, the message of Peter is nothing needs to change. We as believers have hope, and our hope is found in Christ.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org.